All right, we're in Zechariah 12. And on Sunday, we wrapped up this section, chapters 9 through 11, on the flock. So we are entering the last section of the prophet. And what I want us to do, with this chunk especially, I want us to get it all in one sitting. At least get all of the text in one sitting, so that we see where it's going. Because this is one cohesive unit here at the end of Zechariah. So let's start in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 1, and we'll read through the end of the book. The oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. On that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic, and its rider with madness. But for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts their God. On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. And they shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem. And the Lord shall give salvation to the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah. On that day the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. And on that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. On that day the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn, each family by itself, and the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves, and the family of the Shimeites by itself, and their wives by themselves, and all the families that are left, each by itself, and their wives by themselves. On that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. And on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, so that they shall be remembered no more. And also I will remove from the land the prophets and the spirit of uncleanness. And if anyone again prophesies, his father and mother who bore him will say to him, you shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and mother who bore him shall pierce him through when he prophesies. On that day every prophet will be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. He will not put on a hairy cloak in order to deceive, but he will say, I am no prophet. I am a worker of the soil, for a man sold me in my youth. And if one asks him, what are these wounds on your back? He will say, the wounds I received in the house of my friends. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire, and refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. And I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal. And you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. The whole land shall be turned into a plain, from Geba to Rimmon south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site, from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. And on that day a great panic from the Lord shall fall on all of them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come up against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. And on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. And the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall be no longer any traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. Okay. That is kind of a bewildering section of text, to be honest. In fact, whenever we get to chapter 14, as I was studying this, I came across this, what I think is a funny little tidbit. Martin Luther actually wrote 2 commentaries on the book of Zechariah. His first commentary just stops after chapter 13. He doesn't give any explanation. The commentary just stops. And then he published a second commentary just a couple of years after the first one. And all of his comments on Zechariah 14 amount to, at this chapter I give up. I don't know what the prophet means by this. And it's Martin Luther, who, if you've read any Luther, if he has something to say on an issue, he will say it. Luther had one of the most prolific mouths of any Christian in recent history. If there was something on his mind, he was going to say it. And apparently Zechariah 14 just completely stumped him. So obviously we will have it all figured out here tonight. Right? That'll be our aim. All right, but it is a dizzying passage because there's this great battle that's going on. We get it in Zechariah 12, we get it in Zechariah 14, or he takes it up again. There's this great battle that takes place at Jerusalem, against Jerusalem. And over the course of this prophecy, we find in at least a couple of places Judah being on the enemy's side. And then sometimes they're back on Jerusalem's side. We find the Lord standing to defend His people, but only after allowing most of them to be destroyed. And we find that, again, in both sections where we read about the battle. So He allows most of them to be destroyed, but He keeps back a remnant. And the Lord stands against the nations to destroy them. But a remnant of them there is going to be left as well. And anybody who survives that battle, we read in chapter 14, is going to go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, at Jerusalem, and to keep the Feast of Booths. So it's like what we've read before in Zechariah, that the Lord is going to be taking part of the nations as a remnant unto Himself. That there's going to be a remnant composed of Jew and Gentile by the time the Lord is done. And so the general state of things, whenever all is said and done, is that most people, the vast majority of people involved in this battle, whether they're in Jerusalem or in all Judah or the rest of the earth, the rest of the nations, most of them are going to come under judgment and be destroyed. And the Lord is only going to preserve a small remnant that is made up of people from all parties. All right, the thing that we are going to see, or the thing that we have seen more than any other phrase in this section, is on that day. All right, this is all describing the day of the Lord. Let me ask you. I'm going to provide some answers to this. But let me ask you, as you are reading a text, particularly the prophets, because the prophets use this phrase more than anywhere else, what does the day of the Lord mean? What does the day of the Lord refer to? Or what are some things that it can refer to? At the end of time, all right, so the final day of judgment, that day of the Lord, all right, anything else that it can refer to?
The ascension and resurrection.
That is a day of the Lord, yeah. Wayne, did you have one?
Well, in literature, you have these books out. I'm just thinking of one in particular, the Day of the Jackal.
The day of what, sir?
The Day of the Jackal.
The Day of the Jackal.
That's a very popular book.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And it doesn't describe a particular time.
Uh-huh.
It describes more than an event.
Yes.
That happens over a period of time.
Yes.
And it comes about by circumstances and situations brought on by certain choices of other people that are kind of involved in this. You find out, I'm thinking of the day of D-Day. D-Day's that didn't happen all in 24 hours.
Right.
It happened over a period of time.
Yeah, it was an operation.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was taking part in several people who brought about circumstances, situations
Right.
in that area, in that time. So it's a day when certain things happen.
Yeah.
It's a day of victory. It's It's a day of defeat. It's a day of this, a day of that. But
Yes.
It's not a 24-hour period.
Yes, yeah, not necessarily. And I think that is an excellent analogy for thinking about this. Thinking about D-Day as an operation that took place over several days, or as an event. The day of the Lord refers broadly to judgment, the Lord's judgment. Now, over the course of history, how many times does the day of the Lord happen? Well, it happens, as we're reading our scriptures, we read about the day of the Lord all over the place. And we read about the Lord using that particular phrase, the day of the Lord, or a day for the Lord, in talking about His judgment in a lot of circumstances. If you were to read Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, and you were reading about the day of the Lord, all right, those prophets were prophesying in Israel and in Judah before the Babylonian exile. Right? And so what's the day of the Lord referring to? If you had to pick one event that the day of the Lord is referring to, what's it referring to? The Babylonian exile. That's the day of the Lord, is whenever God uses the Chaldeans to come in and judge the people and cart them off. Now, as we've studied the couple of quarters, the captivity doesn't happen in a single day. In fact, it doesn't happen in a single stage. We noted that it happens over the course of 3 different stages. That in the year 605, there's the first deportation where Daniel and his friends and several others were taken off to Babylon. It happens again in 595, if I remember right, and then a final time in 587. Nearly 20 years later, after the first deportation. All right, all of that whole event is the day of the Lord against Judah. And we talked about this when we were talking through Daniel. When we're looking at apocalyptic language, our temptation is to get really specific with things. Like, we want one discrete, narrow historical event that we can point to and that we can say, you see, this event fulfills all of these specific elements of the prophecy. It does this, it does this, it does this. And we noted how apocalyptic language isn't that restrictive. That apocalyptic relies really heavily on metaphor. And how many ways can you take a metaphor? Well, that's the point. The point of using metaphor is that you can fit in double meanings, triple meanings. And what I think we are going to see as we study through these chapters is that the day of the Lord here can refer to at least a couple of different events in history, and likely refers to both, at least both of the particular ones that I have in mind. That the language is not meant to be super restrictive. All right, so let's work through chapters 12 through 14. Just bit by bit here, and talk about what this battle represents, what's going on here. All right, in verse 1 of chapter 12, the oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. And we noted whenever we started studying back in chapter 9 that this phrase, the oracle of the word of the Lord, is an introductory phrase. All right, it's showing us that this next section is different from the section that preceded it. This is a new oracle, right? It's not part of the same oracle as chapters 9 through 11. And 9 through 11 was not part of the same message as chapters 7 and 8. Now, they're consistent, right? They have something to do with each other. But we can look at chapters 12 through 14 as a discrete unit. Right, thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. Right, I think it's important here that the Lord opens up not with a prophecy, not right out of the gate, but He opens up with a description of who He is. All right, what does the Lord appeal to here in verse 1? Thus declares the Lord who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. How's he characterizing himself here in verse 1? Yeah, he's the creator. He's the guy who made everything and breathed life into man. Now, our English translations say, "Thus declares the Lord." A more literal, kind of wooden translation of it is utterance of Yahweh, or utterance of the Lord. Right, this is the utterance of Yahweh, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. How did the Lord create everything? This is really simple, Bible school question. How did the Lord make all of this? With His utterance. His declaration. That is how He stretched out the heavens. That's how He founded the earth. That's how He formed the spirit of man within him, through His utterance. And so what the Lord is appealing to here is that everything that we're reading about here in chapters 12 through 14, everything that the Lord is going to do is consistent with what He does, or what He has done as creator of the universe. That He is speaking, and His speech is going to cause things to happen, just as at the very beginning. Which is why we read about, as we're reading through chapters 12 through 14, a sort of remaking of God's people, a reforming of things. And in fact, it happens in some really interesting ways. That He is going to, for instance, in chapter 13, He's going to take the 1/3 of the sheep that are left alive, and He's going to put them into the fire and refine them. In other words, they're going to be remade. They're going to go into the furnace looking like one thing, and they're going to come out looking completely new. Or in chapter 14, let's see, verse 10, "The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem." Right, the Holy Land is full of hills and mountains. Right, it is not a plain. That's the way the Lord spoke it into existence, was rugged, full of mountains. He is speaking again, and now it is going to be remade as a plain. Right? In a sense, the Lord is starting over. All right, this is going to tie us to a lot of things, by the way. And we could just say this generally. This is similar to the flood. So remember, the Lord uses the flood as a second creation. Right? All of the things that we read about the Lord making over the course of Genesis chapter 1, they are undone in the flood. And then the waters come away. And in fact, remember, the very first thing that we read about the Lord doing in Genesis 1 is His Spirit is hovering over what? The waters. All that's left, all that's there is just water. And from that, the Lord separates the waters out. He makes the dry land. He, fashions all of the beasts and other things to live on the earth and in the sea. Well, what happens after the flood? Well, He has the waters abate. He re-separates the waters. The dry land appears, and creatures go forth upon it. Yet the Lord has remade earth in His judgment. Right? His judgment means that He does creation over again. And that's essentially what's going on here in this battle. That the language of judgment here is, it's framed in the language of creation. That God is going to do away with all of this evil stuff that's been going on. He's going to judge it. He's going to kill it. And what's going to be left is what He intends to be left. Right? And this kind of gets to what we were talking about on Sunday evening in the Q&A. That question about, whether the Lord was upset that people messed things up so quickly after the flood. And the obvious answer is yes. Yeah, that deeply upsets him because he continues talking in that fashion, that he's going to make that kind of judgment. All right, so as we read in chapter 12, verse 2, "Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it." All right, so you have all of the nations and you have Judah gathered against Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is going to be the Lord's agent for judging Judah and the nations. He says, "I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering." Right? We've seen this prophetic language in other places, in other prophets, for example, Isaiah talks about the winepress of the Lord's wrath. Right? That the Lord is pouring out wrath. And He is going to force, we read in various prophets different things, that He's going to force the unfaithful among His people to drink the dregs of the cup, that He's going to force the nations to drink the cup, that they're going to have to partake of the Lord's wrath. In other words, they're going to be destroyed by it. And so we read it here, Jerusalem is a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. "On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves." But Jerusalem is not just going to be an agent of the Lord's wrath, but is also going to show the weakness of the Lord's enemies. That as they take Jerusalem, they're going to be just critically hurt by it, by consuming the cup and by lifting the stone. "On that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness." All right, so the Lord is going to step in and protect. "But for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts their God." In other words, Judah's going to see the evidence of God being with Jerusalem, that God is going to turn some of the people of Judah back to Himself. And He's also going to use Judah, that remnant from Judah, to be part of His judgment against the nations. All right, so just like He's used Jerusalem as a cup of staggering, as a heavy stone, in verse 6 we read, "On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. And they shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem. And the Lord shall give salvation to the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah." All right, so the Lord will use His people as agents of judgment against the world and against the faithless. "On that day, the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David. And the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. And on that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem." So the Lord's might working through them is going to be so great. He says the feeblest, they're going to be like the house of David. And remember, in the ancient way of thinking, who are the feeble? We're talking about the poor, we're talking about the lame, we're talking about the blind, we're talking about widows and orphans. He said all of those people, they're going to be like the house of David. And remember how David is described. Right? David ends up cutting a rather handsome figure. Right? David is strong. says they're going to be like David. In the house of David, they're going to be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. And through His people, the Lord is going to destroy all the nations, all of the faithless people who rebel against the Lord, who fight against the Lord, those that come against Jerusalem. All right, remember what Jerusalem represents. All right, it's not just that, it's not that the people of Jerusalem are going to be especially holy, or that Jerusalem, in the eternal scheme of things, that the physical city of Jerusalem is always holy and chosen. Because what does Jerusalem represent? If we're looking at this as apocalyptic language, as representative language, what does Jerusalem represent? What's special about Jerusalem? The temple. That's where God dwells. If you're attacking Jerusalem, you're not just attacking the people of Jerusalem, you're attacking God. Right? You're attacking Yahweh. Anybody who attacks God, God is going to use His people to destroy them or to judge them. All right. Any questions on verses 1 through 9 here before we move into the next section? Wayne?
I'm getting to this, the prophecy of the church.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this ultimately pertains to. Directly to Israel as a physical place, but rather spiritually to the needs of the church. I think that Jerusalem is the temple, and we are the temple of the Lord.
Yeah, that's certainly the way it's used in the New Testament. That particularly in the end, in Revelation 21, 22, what's descending out of heaven? The New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. All right, and who do we know is always described as the bride of Christ in the New Testament? His church. John is running sort of a double metaphor for the church here. He's calling it the bride of Christ. He's also presenting it as New Jerusalem. It is the place of God's people. It is also the place where people meet God. It is the dwelling place of God. And we find in other places that, yes, the church is described as a temple, that we're described as building blocks of the temple in 1 Peter, that we're associated with the priesthood in 1 Peter. That yes, we are invited, I think, by the New Testament authors to look at these sort of prophecies as pertaining to the church, pertaining to the age of Christ. Yes. Yeah, and we'll spend some time in 1 Corinthians 3 in just a minute once we get into chapter 13. Because there's a lot of stuff that Paul picks up on in 1 Corinthians 3 from this bit of Zechariah. In fact, it is a funny thing about Zechariah 12 through 14, as bewildering as it is, it gets used a lot in the New Testament. It gets used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 3. It gets used by John in Revelation 19 through 22. It gets used by John in his Gospel. And we'll see that here in this next passage. Let's start in verse 10. Chapter 12, verse 10. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. On that day the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn each family by itself. And he goes on to describe the families who are mourning. All right, we'll come to them in just a moment by name. But this bit, especially in verse 10, when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced. We know that phrase from somewhere else in Scripture. This gets quoted in John. Go to John chapter 19. John counts this description as fulfilled prophecy. John chapter 19, verse 31. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it is borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you also may believe. All right, so John says, I witnessed this, and I'm telling you so you can believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. John counts this as fulfilled prophecy, the piercing of Jesus. He says that's Zechariah fulfilled. That they shall mourn over him, that they shall look on him whom they have pierced, as we read in Zechariah 12:10. And John continues with this, by the way. This gets picked up not just as fulfilled prophecy in the crucifixion, but as one of the defining characteristics of Christ. It's part of what makes Christ Christ. It's part of it's one of his defining features. Go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. All right, as John, sees Jesus, as he's presenting Christ, he says, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds." All right, tying into Daniel 7. "And every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, Amen." All right, this is going to be one of the signs of Christ in his judgment, that he is the one who was pierced, and everybody who's responsible for his death will see that piercing and they will weep and wail, which is exactly what Zechariah is telling us here. They are going to mourn over him whom they have pierced. All right, so what we're reading about here is a form of restoration. All right, so judgment has been going out from the Lord. You have all of these people who have been destroyed as they've been attacking Jerusalem, the seat of God's reign. And he says, "I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy." In the prophets, we read of the Lord perfecting his people by pouring out his Spirit on them, by giving them some special restoration. We see this promised using some different language in different places in the prophets, like Jeremiah 31, when the Lord promises the new covenant. He says he's going to write that covenant on everybody's hearts, not on tablets of stone. Right? Or in the prophet Joel, the Lord says that a day is going to come when he is going to pour out his Spirit on all flesh. Peter picks up on that in his sermon in Acts chapter 2 at the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 2, verse 16, "But this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel. In the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in the heavens above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." All right, and Peter appeals to this as fulfilled prophecy and what is going on in his time. That in the wake of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that God is pouring out His Spirit on all flesh. Which, notice how Joel phrases it, and as Peter quotes him in verse 20, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and magnificent day. That this is part of the day of the Lord playing out. That the death, burial, and resurrection and the formation of the church, these are a day of the Lord that are taking place. Alright, so Zechariah prophesies about that here in Zechariah chapter 12, that he's going to pour out his Spirit, that they are going to be remorseful as they look on him whom they have pierced. And by the way, remember, what's the response to Peter's sermon in Acts chapter 2? All of the men who heard it were pricked in their heart, that they were sorrowful over what they had done. These men who were responsible for the piercing of Jesus. All right, and all of these, we have these families named. The land shall mourn each family by itself, Zechariah 12:12. The family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves. The family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves. All right, and so on for Levi, and for Shimei, and for all of the families that are left. All right, so the Lord picks out, in particular, two families, the families of David and Levi. And he also mentions their sons, Nathan and Shimei. And he says that each of their households, they're going to mourn, and their wives will mourn by themselves. In other words, everybody is going to be mourning sincerely over this. And it's not going to be something that is where they're under some sort of coercion or social pressure to mourn. All right, Nathan is not going to be mourning because he feels like he has to because he's David's son and David is mourning. All right, Shimei is not going to be mourning because Levi is mourning and he feels like he has to. Their wives are not going to be mourning because they feel like their husbands are mourning. But each of them are going to be mourning by themselves. That this reformation that is taking place in them, the pouring out of the Spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, this is going to be something authentic that comes upon each of them. All right, and this little bit of 12 through 14 closes in chapter 13, verse 1. On that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. That the Lord, besides pouring out His Spirit on them, is also going to cleanse them, remove their sin and uncleanness from them by washing them in a fountain. All right, we'll get to the significance of that later, and we will have to save chapters 13 and 14, what little bit we have left, for Thursday. Any final questions or comments before we close up tonight? All right. Well, thank you so much for your questions and your comments and your kind attention this evening.